Who was Henry Luce?
Well, Henry Luce was the child of American missionaries in China, who, with his best friend in college, Britt Haddon, founded Time magazine. He went on to found Fortune magazine, Sports Illustrated, Life magazine, The March of Time, Newsreel. Really, perhaps the most important periodical publisher in American history.
And why did you decide to write a book about him?
Well, I felt that in our understanding of American journalism, particularly in the 20th century, there was a hole. There was something we didn't understand. I think if you look at what happened to American journalism between 1900 and 1960 or 1970, the biggest difference is how much more analytical, how much more interpretive American journalism became, how much more likely reporters were to synthesize information and explain it for us. I think that's the most powerful way, I think, of understanding what happened in American journalism in the last century, and I think Henry Luce goes a long way toward explaining that change.
Let me begin where you start in your book in describing him and what he represented. In the late 1930s, you say he was America's single most powerful and innovative mass communicator. Henry Robinson Luce had started distinctive and popular magazines. Taken together, these publications provided a more gripping and coherent view of the world than was to be found in similar periodicals and daily newspapers up until then. How so?
Well, I think the difference is, one thing I did when I was working on the book is that I looked at American newspapers in the 1930s. I looked at competing magazines in the 1930s. And what struck you was that other publications tended to give you a mass of facts, whereas Luce's magazine, especially Time and Life, tried to more, I think, than most, to weave them into a coherent whole, to try to explain what had happened the previous week. And that's what made Luce very different, but also what caused Luce, I think, to anticipate the direction of American journalism, not just in print, but in broadcast as well, where so much information was repackaged, reformulated so that it made sense.
And this is, again, goes to the early part of the book, but he spent a lot of time in China as he was growing up. Why?
Well, his parents were missionaries in China. His father was a Presbyterian minister in North China. Luce was actually born in China, and you know, he and his siblings were raised in a compound in North China, and I believe Luce was about 14 when he actually left China to come to school in the United States.
Did that affect his thinking of the United States and the world?
It did very much, for a couple of reasons. One is, this is a moment, the beginning of the 20th century, when the United States is feeling its oats, is feeling its sense that we are a world power. We are the seventh power, whatever the number was at that time. And yet one thing Luce had to deal with, as many Americans did living overseas at the time, was the haughtiness of Great Britain, of British people that they would deal with. Luce went to a British school in Chefoo, what was then Chefoo, China, and was subject to their humiliations. The Brits looked down on us as you know, the colonials and so forth, and it really infuriated him, and it made him more nationalistic. It's often been said that missionary children were more nationalistic than Americans living, you know, back home in Nebraska or Alabama, because of the humiliations they put up with overseas.
What led to the start of Time magazine, and who funded the operation?
Well, a couple of things. They had the idea, Haddon and Luce, going back to prep school. Actually, if you look at their prep school newspaper, which I did, what you'll see is they were convinced that there was too much news in the newspaper, that what was needed was a new kind of newspaper. That was their original idea, by the way, but a new type of news publication that organized information in a way that the busy young man, and Luce and Haddon imagined themselves as their reader, would be able to read it and know what they needed to know in the early 1920s. And that was, I think, the major incentive there. As far as the funding, there was a marvelous advantage to going to Yale or Harvard in the early 1920s, and that was it connected you to a lot of families of great wealth. Although Luce and Haddon's families weren't particularly well-to-do, certainly not Luce's, they did have access through their clubs and so forth at Yale to some very wealthy families, and they hit those families up for contributions to start the magazine.
And when Time magazine was first launched, how many people read it and how was it distributed?
I don't have those numbers in front of me. It was, the circulation was fairly modest initially, but it was a money-making proposition within a few years. I mean, they were breaking even.
What has resulted from Time magazine? What is the Time Inc.? How many companies now make up the corporation?
Quite a few. Of course, Time Inc. Merged with Warner Communications in 1990. It bought Turner Broadcasting, Turner's Holdings in the mid-1990s, and then that fish was eaten up by AOL in 2001. So there's been, it's now really is a vast empire of many different media.
There's another photograph of Henry Luce and his wife, Clara Booth. This is from their honeymoon in Cuba back in the mid-1930s. Who was Clara Booth and how did the two meet?
She was an extraordinary woman who met Luce in the mid-1930s. Luce was married and had several children, several sons. Luce was absolutely captivated by her. She was a very striking woman, very beautiful woman, very smart woman. And Luce was absolutely, I think, and madly in love with her, and divorced his first wife and married Claire, I believe in 1936. They remained married for the remainder of Luce's life. She went on to a very interesting career. She had been a playwright, an actress, stage actress. She was also elected to Congress from Connecticut and actually sought the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate and lost it to Prescott Bush, the president's grandfather.
What kind of relationship did Mr. Luce have with presidents of his time?
Very checkered, I think, up until the election of Dwight Eisenhower in 1952. Luce didn't really begin to know presidents, begin to be taken seriously as a journalistic force until the late 1930s, early 1940s. Although he was affecting journalism, many journalists were reading Time and thought it was very smart and worth imitating. Luce came to know Roosevelt and Truman, didn't get along with either one of them. He felt FDR patronized him. Roosevelt would also call him Henry, when everyone who knew him called him Harry, that sort of thing. Eisenhower's election changed the relationship. Luce had more access. His wife was actually named ambassador to Italy by President Eisenhower. And Luce had fairly steady access, or ready access, I should say, to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson.
One of the things, Mr. Bachman, that we were able to come up with is a conversation between Mr. Luce and President Lyndon Johnson, this courtesy of the Johnson tapes at the library in Texas.
Hello?
Hello?
Henry, how are you?
Mr. President?
I hope you're having as good a sunshine as we are.
Oh, ours is much better.
Well, I don't know.
Very reliable.
We're about 75, 80 down here, and it's just
really?
as warm and pretty as it can be.
Well, I wish you were here.
Did you have a good Christmas and good?
We had a lovely Christmas, and I just, when you was having lunch, and so Claire said that she wanted me to give you her best regards and said that she'd like to come and call on you sometime as you go.
I wish you would. Any day she's around, just tell her I'll be waiting with open arms, and you give her a big hug for me.
All right, I'll tell her that then.
I'm sorry I interrupted your lunch. I just wanted to visit with you and tell you, when are you coming back east?
I'll be in New York on the 16th.
Why don't you come down to see me the next day or two after you get up there?
Well, I was kind of figuring on wanting to come down about a week or so after that.
Will you do that?
And I might have a little package of goods to sell you.
Well, I'm ready to buy them. I want you to take my tax bill and pass it for me.
Oh, yeah, well, we'll do that.
I've got tax bill and civil rights, and I've got to get them both before they start playing too much politics. And then we can have a lot of time to have fun in the campaign if we'll get these things behind us.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we've been for those two things. We're a little disappointed in the tax bill that it didn't go further in a way,
Yeah, well, we're
for it, we're for the other ones.
what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get our budget down to $100 billion and take enough out of these archaic establishments to give a little bit on our social consciousness, a little poverty stuff, and a little for the Appalachia area of West Virginia and Kentucky and Pennsylvania. And I think I'm going to work it out where I can get not too far away from what it was last year.
Well, I've been very impressed with what I read about that.
We've made some progress on it, but I've just got to get my tax bill passed, and I want you to give me some help.
All right. Well, in the meanwhile, I'll talk to Henry Dono about that.
Will you do that?
I'll talk to him about it. He's supposed to be calling me in a few minutes.
All right, give Claire my love, and I'll see you the 18th, 20th, 21st.
Well, a little later, because I want to get this package worked up a little bit.
All right, okay.
I'll call you as soon as I get back there.
All right, to get some sunshine for me.
Thank what?
Take some of that sunshine for me.
Thank you. Thank you for all your Texas hospitality.
I've got to go back to the coal mines on Sunday, and I'll be thinking of you out there in Arizona.
That's the trouble with being President of the United States, yeah.
I'll see you.
Right.
Bye.
James Baughman, that conversation from 1964 and one of the photographs in your book from September 1965 with Mr. Luce and Mr. Johnson. What do you learn from that?
One thing I'm noticing is Luce's machine gun delivery. He had a speech impediment as a child that was pretty serious, and I'm struck by how quickly he spoke. That's a small thing. Of course, what you're also seeing is what was called at the time the Johnson treatment, in which Lyndon Johnson would call journalists, fellow politicians, members of Congress, and work them over, flatter them, that sort of thing. And you're noticing that. He's clearly cultivating Luce's favor regarding the tax bill and the civil rights bill.
Let's start simply. Who was William Randolph Hearst?
William Randolph Hearst was the son of a 49er miner who became a millionaire and one of the country's first women philanthropists. And he began as a newspaper publisher, and by the 30s was the most important media magnate, media mogul in the world. He owned newspapers, magazines, newsreel stations, a movie studio, radio stations, a little radio network, and much, much more.
And was he the first American media mogul?
I think he's the first, yeah. If media mogul means, if we look at what the word means, media is a communications medium. Mediums put their hands on the table and communicate to the living from the dead. Well, media is that communications medium. It's that interface between where a message is coming from and the people who are going to get it. And what Hearst did was Hearst understood right away that once he had gathered the news, once he had written his editorials, once he had his opinions, it made no sense to confine it just to newspapers. Why not put that same news and those same opinions on the radio, in newsreels, in magazines? So in moving out from newspapers to these other media, I think it's fair to say he's the first media mogul.
What did he own?
Gosh. He owned newspapers and major newspapers in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Boston, every major city in the United States except Philadelphia. He made a deal early with Adolph Ochs, the New York Times, who wanted to move to Philadelphia. He owned major magazines all over the world, including Cosmopolitan, which was the most important opinion journal. He owned his own newsreel service. He had a radio network. He had his own news service that competed with the AP and the UPI. He had a feature service. He had a couple of syndicate services. And he owned his own movie studio, which was a very Cosmopolitan Studios which was in the beginning of the 20th century a major, major producer of motion pictures.
One of the pictures you have in your book is of William Randolph Hearst in 1919 greeting the American soldiers coming back. He's standing amidst several politicians. Did politicians fear or did they want his endorsement? Did he endorse?
This is a very interesting picture. Hearst was opposed to World War I. And when the Americans entered World War I, he sort of tepidly approved, but argued for a peace treaty from the very beginning to the very end. You see here, when it was announced that he was going to greet the soldiers, there was all sorts of hubbub. There were letters, congressional reports, congressional inquiries, all of which said that this man should not be allowed to greet the soldiers. He snuck in there at the last minute, so that picture was taken. He was feared. He was not loved. He was feared by politicians because he spoke directly to millions and millions of Americans. At the height of his career in the 20s and the 30s, 1 out of every 5 Americans read a Hearst newspaper.
The politicians feared William Randolph Hearst. How did he influence politics and public policy?
I got interested in Hearst from the very beginning because I wanted to write about the media and politics. And the most interesting way to do that was to take a man who was a multimillionaire, who was a media mogul, and who wanted to use and was willing to use all of his power to get himself elected president. Never got himself elected president. Got pretty close. In 1904, he came in second in the balloting for the Democratic Convention. Never got himself elected president, though he served 2 terms in Congress, but he set the agenda. When he took up an issue, whether it was the World Court, whether it was the income tax, that issue became a major issue, and every politician had to take a stand on that issue.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
You mentioned the World Court and the income tax issue. What were his positions?
He was a West Coast isolationist. What do I mean by that? I mean that he was absolutely opposed to American intervention or American involvement in the affairs in Europe. He believed that Europe was the old world, Europe was dying, Europe was engaged in this civil war that resulted in the Great War and World War II, and that America was the new world it had to keep out. He was not an isolationist, however, when it came to Mexico, to Panama, to South America, to the Philippines, obviously, or to the Pacific. He thought that's where America's interests lay, and that's where we should be putting our energies. He was absolutely opposed to the World Court. He was absolutely opposed to the League of Nations. He was absolutely opposed to the First World War and the Second World War. He did not want American boys to die. He did not want American dollars spent propping up England in a war for supremacy in Europe.
You say he was against World War II also. Did that hurt him in readership?
He quickly came around. By the time World War II came around, he was a relatively old man, and he had begun to withdraw a little bit from his newspapers. He was smart enough to know that once war was declared, he was going to be an American, he was going to be a patriot, and he was going to be full square in favor of prosecuting that war. But he argued throughout, in World War I and in World War II, for some sort of negotiations. What hurt him, and what hurt him very badly, what nearly bankrupted his empire and what nearly destroyed him, was when in mid-1930s he took on Franklin Roosevelt. He had gotten Roosevelt elected. He had supported him. And then after the income tax, and after he began to think that Roosevelt was too much of an internationalist, he went after him. And he went after him viciously. Hearst did not believe in neutral journalism. He believed in advocacy journalism. He wrote his own editorials, and he put them on the front page, and he signed them in big, big letters. And then he read those editorials on the radio and talked them on his newsreels. So if you bought a Hearst newspaper, there was no way to escape the editorial stance of that newspaper. And when he went after Roosevelt, he alienated many of the lower middle class, and working people that made up the bulk of his circulation. He was so violently anti-Roosevelt, anti-New Deal, that his readers had to make a choice, Roosevelt or Hearst. And more often than not, the choice was Roosevelt. His circulation declined, and he got into terrible trouble in 1937, and in effect lost his control of his empire for about 5-6 years until World War II.